The introduction short. For those of you that don't know me, you'll get to know me better as we move into the conversation. So I'm hoping we can have an open and frank and candid conversation around OER.
So where did you first encounter the concept of OER, Wayne? When did it first come across your radar as a profession?
Well, I've been in open learning for a long time. I started my professional career at the University of South Africa, UNISA, and some people may not be aware of this, but UNISA was in fact the first distance teaching university of the world. And the principles underpinning distance education through the philosophy of open learning, of course, are very present in the delivery modality. And that's where my interest in the practices of open learning was first peaked, specifically around the OER space. For those of you that know me, I have a very keen interest in the use of free and open source software. And back in the late 90s, 1999, when people like David Wiley had started playing around with the educational equivalent of open source software in the early definitions of open content, is where I really started, focusing in the space. So it's been a while. It's been a long and interesting journey.
So just give us a working definition of OER, because I imagine most of the people in this webinar will be aware, but it's useful if we all just work to the same broad definitions. Give us a working definition of what are OER.
Okay. What I might do, I've just got a couple of slides to set context, and sitting in those slides, I've got the UNESCO definition of OER, so that's maybe a good way of introducing that concept.
By all means, do you want to share? You should be able to share.
We'll quickly start sharing, and in theory, it should all be working.
Yep, you're good to go.
Cool. So just by way of starting, I think it's important just to reflect and recognize the importance of sustainability, but also to note that there's no form of educational delivery that is more cost effective, more scalable, or more sustainable than open education. And that is what I wake up every morning aiming to achieve. But I think it's important to remember that context. So as I mentioned, I work for the OER Foundation, which is an independent charitable organization. We are registered with the New Zealand Charities Trust. We are entirely self-funded. We rely on donor grants and membership contributions from participating institutions around the world. And we focus solely on the implementation of OER. By way of definition, being a UNESCO chair, I guess I'm obligated to use the UNESCO definition, but it's a pretty robust one. Open educational resources are learning, teaching, and research materials that are produced or published in any format. They need to meet a couple of conditions. One, they must either reside in the public domain, that is when copyright has expired, or artifacts that are dedicated specifically to the public domain, or they must be licensed under an open content license. The second factor is learners and educators must be able to access those resources at no cost. And then the third aspect are, of course, the permissions, and the permissions that open licensing provides specifically for learners and educators to reuse, repurpose, adapt, and redistribute those materials. So a little bit about the history of the OER movement. The concept was first coined by UNESCO's Forum on the Impact of Open Courseware for Higher Education in Developing Countries back in 2002. And a lot of work has happened since then in terms of moving this agenda forward. In 2012, we, in celebrating the first decade of OER, there was the Paris Declaration at UNESCO headquarters. And then work started commencing towards the development of an OER, a UNESCO OER recommendation. In 2017, the Ljubljana Declaration was a commitment to awareness and action, preparing the ground for the adoption of the UNESCO OER recommendation by member states in November 2019. And of interest, the OER recommendation was adopted unanimously by member states. And there are a number of implications for the OER recommendation, including the requirement for member states to report back to General Conference on the specific progress they are making with OER at the national level.
And that, so in New Zealand context, presumably that would be the Ministry of Education would have to feed back to UNESCO?
That is a very interesting question, where we are at the moment. So organizationally, the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO resides within the Ministry of Education. However, it's a complicated process in terms of where this ball or whose court this ball is in. So on the one level, implementation, it falls within the province of the Tertiary Education Commission, whereas the ministry is responsible for policy-related issues. And so we're not entirely sure where this ball lies at the moment, and we're in conversations to figure out, well, who's going to, or take the first shot at the ball. Because if we are talking about a policy requirement, New Zealand does not have a national policy for OER. If you have a conversation with the Tertiary Education Commission, they will say, well, what is the policy around, around open education? We can't implement if we don't have the policies. So it's an ongoing conversation, yeah.
Presumably part of your objective at the OERU, and indeed your work at UNESCO Chair, is to try and to encourage New Zealand to establish that kind of policy. Would that not be beneficial?
Absolutely. So we are engaged with ongoing conversations with the respective policy agencies that are touch points for this. And as a UNESCO chair, incidentally, there are only 2 UNESCO chairs in New Zealand, of which the UNESCO chair in OER is one. So we are in conversation with the National Commission for UNESCO in figuring out how we take this forward, in terms of figuring out how do we as New Zealand respond to our obligations under the OER recommendation. Right. But I think it's worthwhile having a look at what the 5 action areas are of the recommendation, and then we can have a conversation around the touch points, for individuals, because the implementation of visionary concepts like open education requires both a bottom-up as well as a top-down policy approach, I think. The first action area, of course, is to build capacity of stakeholders, educators, and learners to find, reuse, create, adapt, and share OER. The second action area, and UNESCO recognizes that the maturity of policy development, at least at a global scale, is still in its infancy, certainly at the national level. And that is to support supportive policy development for OER. The third objective, of course, and as educators, I'm confident that we can subscribe to this, is to ensure inclusive and equitable access to quality OER.
Can I just ask a question? When we're talking about supportive policy at a national level, presumably we're also talking then about legislative frameworks to encourage people to explore different copyright options, and presumably that becomes a legal issue as well as a kind of policy issue.
Absolutely. So it's policy at the national level, and in fact, New Zealand has demonstrated leadership, at least within this compulsory school sector, around some of the open licensing protocols and frameworks. So New Zealand has the NZ Goal, which is the New Zealand Government Open Access Licensing Framework, where all Crown copyright is strongly encouraged to be released under an open Creative Commons attribution license.
Right.
But sitting within NZ Goal is a strong encouragement for school boards of trustees that oversee the copyright of individual school teachers adopt Creative Commons licensing policies. Mm-hmm. So there was certainly at the compulsory school level an incentive. And when I last looked, these numbers would be outdated, but there were well over 200 schools, boards of trustees within New Zealand that have adopted and implemented open licensing policies. But around the policy development side, certainly within tertiary education, so there are no hooks within the NZ Goal framework encouraging higher education institutions to adopt open policies. But that said, at the institutional level, we can progress and implement open policies. And so, for example, on the open access side of the equation, which refers to the release of published research outputs under open licenses, there are a couple of universities that actually have open access policies encouraging the output of academic research under open licenses. But other than Otago Polytechnic, I'm not aware of any tertiary education institution in New Zealand that actually has an OER policy, which is, of course, the teaching materials side of the equation. Obviously, in order for the sustainability of OER, we need to nurture models that at least contribute and support the fiscal sustainability of OER. And of course, the fifth action area there is international cooperation in OER. And at the foundation, we are involved in each of those 5 aspects in terms of our implementation. But I think that, I mean, one of the important messages, I mean, the driving force underpinning the concept of OER and at least UNESCO's interest in pushing forward a recommendation is simply this: educational materials that are funded by taxpayer dollars should be released openly for the benefit of its citizens. And I mean, we can't dispute or argue. It's what education is about. Learners should not have to pay twice for the educational materials, especially when they have been funded by public money. So that is a key driving force, underpinning the OER movement. So in terms of how we work in the space, one of our flagship initiatives is the OER Universitas, or the OERU for short. And the key challenge, at least from a charitable perspective, that we are aiming to address is widening access to educational opportunity. And we know, conservatively estimated, that over the next 2 decades, we need to provide for an additional 100 million places for learners who are qualified to enter tertiary education or post-secondary education, but who won't have the privilege of access, either due to lack of funding in order to participate, or because lack of provision in the respective countries. And thinking about how we're going to tackle these challenges in a post-COVID world, there was this report published by UNESCO at the end of February, pointing out that 2/3 of our poorer countries around the world are experiencing substantive cuts to their education budgets. This is a huge global challenge in terms of ensuring equitable and inclusive access to education for learners around the world. And OER is one of the ways in which we can achieve it. But a thought experiment, sure.
Before you move on, Wayne, just the concept of building the OERU programs that will deliver learning to those 100 million learners. What's the who designs the curriculum? Who actually engineers and validates and approves OERU learning experiences? Presumably there must be an internal validation process, or these are individual courses, or these are micro credentials, or can it be anything? I mean, what's the provision likely to look like?
Pretty much all of the above. I think some of the answers will become apparent as I explain the model.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
No. It's a critical question, because the approach that we took, and you know, in fact, on the advice of Sir John Daniel at the original foundation meeting of the OERU back in February 2011, we are actually celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. The advice that Sir John gave us at the time was not to innovate on too many fronts simultaneously. Implementing open online courses that were entirely based on OER was of itself a huge innovation. And so we didn't attempt to innovate new ways of credentialing within the system, given that higher education is traditionally very conservative. So we sought to design models that would facilitate international credit transfer within existing policies of partner institutions. So in other words, designing a strategic approach, if you will, with the path of least resistance, so to speak. Because the concept of OER itself was quite a radical innovation back, you know, a decade ago, in terms of building, you know, open online courses based entirely on OER as the one innovation. The other innovation, of course, in fact, we weren't the first, but was a disaggregated service provision model. So in other words, where you're
unpack that a little bit.
So if you think of a traditional university or polytechnic learning experience, a learner purchases a full package, right? They purchase the content, they purchase the tutorial support services, they purchase the technology support services, they purchase the assessment services that are mapped to formal credit for university qualifications. It is possible to think of a model where you can disaggregate a number of those services and only sell a portion of the package. And that's effectively what we've done with the OERU. We provide content services and learning services, open online courses entirely for free for learners. They can engage in learning experience, participate in courses. When and if they are ready for assessment, they can then purchase assessment services from an accredited provider who then only charges for the assessment service. So the second innovation of the OERU was to develop a working model of disaggregated service provision that leads to formal university qualifications. And that's where we started, was with this thought experiment. We've got this big challenge in widening access. But what if accredited institutions assembled only 2 courses based entirely on OER? And what if those institutions who assembled their courses and made them available for OER agreed to provide assessment services just for those 2 courses for formal academic credit? And that is essentially the thought experiment, if you will, that has driven the work in the design and implementation of the OERU. And that's how the OERU model works. Learners access open online courses based entirely on OER that are designed and are mapped to formal university qualifications. They work through the process, and when and if they are ready for assessment, they approach one of the partners who are offering assessment services, pay a service fee for that assessment in order to gain credit towards recognized qualifications. And so we started small. You can appreciate that this is a big vision. So we're taking small incremental steps, because you alluded to the question earlier on is, how do you decide on curriculum? How do you decide on, a pathway that is going to make sense for learners? And what we did within the OERU network is collaboratively we decided that we would focus on a first year of study. And we targeted, so we found 2 of our partner institutions that would be willing to offer a first year qualification in parallel with recognizing credit transfer from a list of pre-approved courses that were assembled and donated by partner institutions around the network for these 2 qualifications. And the 2 qualifications we agreed on was, the first is a Certificate of General Studies, which is conferred by Thompson Rivers University in Canada. And incidentally, while a Certificate of General Studies may not necessarily appear to be a very vocationally relevant qualification, it is in fact the Bachelor of General Studies at Thompson Rivers University is the most popular degree. And the reason for that is mature adults who are seeking to get their first qualification in order to progress with postgraduate study.
And presumably they also get the opportunity to personalize or customize their study quite significantly within that program.
Absolutely, yeah. And the second qualification we have on the books is a Certificate of Higher Education Business, which is conferred by the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. And that has significance because that makes, because of the CAT system within broader Europe, contributes to the transferability of OERU course credit across the network. One of the other aspects of the OERU, which I think is quite important, is from our inception, we took the decision to assemble all OERU full courses as a series of micro courses. And in part, that was to deal with the challenges when you're thinking about international credit transfer, was to deal with the differences in course size in different jurisdictions around the world. I mean, and so, for example, in North America, a standard course is typically 120 notional learning hours. Standard courses here within New Zealand are typically 150 notional learning hours. Australia, 160. UK modules are typically 200 notional learning hours. So when designing and developing the OERU system, we had to think carefully about how would we facilitate the international credit transfer. And the way we achieved that was by assembling all courses as individual micro courses that equate to 40 notional learning hours. And so then how the system works now is 3 micro courses is the equivalent of a full course in North America. 4 micro courses, the equivalent of a full course in New Zealand and Australia. 5, a UK module. But of course, strategically, and this was always part of our planning, is assembling micro courses or courses as a series of micro courses. It makes the step towards implementing stackable micro credentials a lot easier because our entire system is designed to support that. Yeah. And so, for example, this is the first year level course, Learning in the Digital Age. It consists of those 4 micro courses. Learners can gain assessments for individual micro courses, which would then articulate into the 2 qualifications. Okay. And here within New Zealand, we of course partnered with EduBits, who offer assessment services for small bites of learning. Each of our individual micro courses have been approved as short courses towards qualifications that will be recognized for credit transfer internationally within our system. So if you take a look at the course Introduction to Project Management, it consists of those 4 micro courses listed there. Learners can present themselves for assessed learning for each of those micro courses offered through Otago Polytechnic's EduBits system, and now Tupukenga. And that credit will be recognized towards the Certificate of Higher Education Business at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. So that's how the system functions. And to the best of our knowledge, we have established the world's first transnational stackable micro-credentialing system towards university qualifications that is based entirely on OER.
Okay.
So let me just leave it there. You know, achieving big visions is a lot easier when we have a number of institutions working together in order to move this forward, because it's very hard for a single institution to achieve this on their own. So let me just leave it there.
Yeah, what we got 15 minutes. I'm encouraging people to post questions into the chat while they hopefully build up in the background. So a question from me then, Wayne. So I mean, I've worked around OER and reusable content and learning objects and for some 20 odd years. And obviously part of the issue has always been trying to persuade individual academics to avoid the notion of kind of it's not homegrown, and therefore it's not, you know, it doesn't reflect my academic view or my academic credentials. And so people reinvent things. Most recent institution I worked at, there were 5 versions of a first-year strategy course taught by 5 different people, all designing their entirely all of their content. So that's kind of, I think that's the prevailing ethos, I think, certainly in most tertiary sectors, maybe not so much in the K-12 sector. So how would you suggest individuals, if they want to explore this for themselves and to make a contribution to some of their institutional policy, individuals that are part of this webinar, what would you suggest that they do? What could be their first step at an individual level to kind of get engaged?
Sure, it's a very good question. I have in the past referred to one of the real challenges we are faced with is crossing this chasm from sharing to learn to learning to share. And what I mean by that is most educators, I mean, I certainly entered the teaching profession with one purpose, and that was to share knowledge and to share that knowledge freely. That's why I teach. And most educators will understand the notion of it's actually a good thing to share knowledge in support of learning. The challenge that we have is making the cultural shift in terms of learning to share. And if I compare that, I mean, and I've been fortunate, I've been engaged in the free and open source software movement for a long time. And the cultural disposition of a free software developer is very different to that of an educator. And that is, if we are tasked with developing a new piece of software, the very first thing we will do is we'll go and see what other free software is available that we can adapt and modify in order to save money and get our product quicker to market. And that's a cultural difference. And that is something that we as educators need to learn, is that cultural disposition. When I'm tasked with developing something new, instead of creating the whole thing myself, what is already out there that I can potentially adapt and modify to suit my own purposes? Now, to respond directly to your question, I mean, there are some skills in life which appear to be quite easy to learn, but are in fact rather complex. I mean, think about learning, you know, a child learning to ride a push bike, or a young child learning to swim. those are complex skills. But you can't learn to swim by reading a book.
Yeah.
And so the response to your question is, if you want to learn how to develop these skills, come and join us and test the waters and try and develop something small using OER, because there are a number of aspects around OER design and development that are a little different from sort of conventional design and development. So they little things like designing and developing resources in editable file formats. Thinking about systems for proper version control, because if we are collaborating together, we need to know what kind of changes have been made and what are the extent of those changes in order to monitor quality, for example. Other practical things is if you're designing, an individual learning pathway or a lesson or a sequence, is to avoid simple things like numbering those lessons, because a downstream user might not insert that at week 10, they would prefer to have it at week 5. And if all your educational materials are referencing, sequence numbers or internal linking, it makes the reuse a lot harder.
Made that mistake.
Yeah, and so it's hard, you don't learn those things by reading books. You learn those things by doing stuff. And, come and do some stuff with us. That's a good way to learn.
Right. So, well, we got some interesting questions popping up already. So Vanessa's asked what characteristics are assumed of learners for these credentials. I think she's referring to the OER credentials that are already in place. So are they English speaking? Is it very much from a Western perspective? What's the digital literacy expectation? So are there examples of good OER courseware that aren't in English and that are pitched for low-level digital literacy, or is there a kind of a sort of a foundational level of knowledge that's assumed?
It's a very big question. So
you've got
the approach. Yeah. Right. So the approach that we've taken at OERU is we have an optional new participant OERU survey where we get demographic information of the kinds of individuals that are participating in OERU courses. And it's a very diverse audience, predominantly second or third English language learners, very low levels of digital skills, and the skills of being able to learn online. And so our courses are designed to be able to support learners, fitting those profiles. So our design process is no different from conventional design in that we aim to design our learning experiences for the target audience we're serving. But obviously it takes a little bit more work in terms of generating those demographics for designing for those audience. And in fact is one of the reasons why we developed that first year level course, Learning in a Digital Age, which is about it's a course focused on developing the digital proficiencies for learners to succeed in learning online on the internet. And it's a course which would be particularly relevant to many of your learners, I suspect, and you would be free to use those courses. So that's how we sort of tackle that question. But the language issues, sadly, there is a dominance of English in OER with far fewer resources available in the lesser spoken languages. But we're doing a lot of work to try and move that agenda forward. For example, UNESCO is working on the translation of our course on copyright and OER into French, so that we can support Francophone countries around the world. So it's a big challenge, and we have lots to do. Yeah. So
thank you for that. Vanessa said thank you as well. Bernard's got a question around how does the volunteer work, volunteer support work for these courses. I noticed that in your sort of schema, it talks about individual academic support available by volunteers. So how would someone become a volunteer? Through the institution or through the OERU?
Always an individual. If you're warm-blooded and you have an interest in this stuff, you can volunteer.
Okay, but they volunteer to you? To the OERU?
It's working to support and assisting learners in OERU courses.
Oh,
so you must remember, our courses are made entirely freely of charge. We have open forums. Individuals can engage in supporting learners who have questions if they want to.
Okay, thank you for that. Victor is asking, is there not a tension between the ideals of the OER and the desire for universities to make profit? So if I share my teaching materials as OER, am I likely to cross swords with my institution?
Oh, absolutely. There's a healthy tension between the two. And look, understandably, universities are hard pressed in terms of revenue models. And so one of the ways universities have moved forward is to corporatize and compete in terms of their offerings, and that generates revenue. But by the same token, an OER approach is not an either or challenge. One can think about OER as building a parallel learning universe in being able to support learners who would never have the resources ever to come and study at your institution. And most publicly funded institutions have a social justice mission in terms of they are using public money. And so most of our partners participate in OERU. They don't make all their courses available as OER, but they are comfortable as part of a social justice mission by making a small contribution in order to help a wider population who aren't going to have the privilege of a tertiary education if we do nothing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we've got one final question. Where does the tertiary learner start? So if we know someone who is interested in studying, maybe doesn't have the resources to study, how would they start? How would they be aware of what's available in terms of open educational resource-based learning?
Acquiring the skills in terms of how to find and identify OER. And one of the ways they can do that is by taking our free course, Learning in the Digital Age, which is available to anybody in the world, which is specifically designed for learners to develop those skills in moving forward.
And I imagine from an ideal perspective, you would like institutions, which is very often the first port of call for a tertiary. If they visit an institution, they might likely to go to that website. Ideally, it would be nice if there were links to that free resource right up front, right? I mean, wouldn't that be? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So, well, listen, thank you very much, Wayne. I mean, I said to you earlier, when we met in 2004, your enthusiasm was infectious. I went back to the UK and started working on learning objects and repositories, and I worked on a European project, Replica, which was about 7 institutions trying to design shareable resources. And inevitably, we made lots and lots and lots of mistakes. I got lots of flat file images that were supposed to be shareable. So like you say, it's a journey. Everyone is learning, which is great to see, and it's very reassuring to know that there are some people in New Zealand, particularly you, who are taking a lead. So thank you very much for your time today. Very useful, very hopefully very enjoyable and very interesting for the participants. If there are any,
sure.
I was going to say, is there anything you'd like to end with? I'm going to give you the final word, and then we'll ask Ralph to stop the recording.
Hey, just a quick plug. One of the areas we are looking to experiment in is OER-enabled professional academic development. And we have taken a course that was developed by eCampus Ontario. It's called the Extend Ontario Initiative, an outstanding professional development sequence published as OER, designed specifically to build digital proficiencies of educators in the space. And We've converted all these materials for the OERU platform and done some customizations for the New Zealand context. I'm planning to launch a New Zealand collaboration for all tertiary education institutions who are interested in professional academic development to come and join us in this pilot, in rolling out this professional development opportunity for educators. It consists of 6 modules. They are badged. If an educator achieves the 6 badges, they can become an empowered educator. So watch this space if you want to test the waters and get your toes wet and learn a little bit about OER. This is a great opportunity to do so. So let me leave it there.
All right, thank you once again. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who participated. I'm not sure if Ralph is still here, so I will pause the recording. Thank you very much once again. Watch the recording back if you missed any element when it's posted on the FLANZ website, which will probably be within a matter of days, I suspect. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Wayne.
Kia ora.